Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of Trivium China's bi-weekly politics flash talk. Back again with you all as sort of a newbie to the politics talks. I am Andrew Polk. Glad to be here, sort of hosting the talk alongside my co-founder and partner based out of London here, Trey, and also our head of politics research, Trey McCarver. Trey, how you doing?
Yeah, doing great. Excited to talk Chinese politics.
Great. Glad to be here with you as well. So before we dive in, as always, I want to do just a brief housekeeping up top. Same housekeeping notes that we've had for the past few weeks, but just want to remind everybody that who's watching this that word of mouth really is our best avenue for getting Trivium's name out there. So please do, if you know of a professional contact who needs more support on China policy, intel, and analysis, please let them know about us. Send them our way. It's always great to have recommendations from current listeners, viewers, clients to help get our name out there. So we'd appreciate that. The other issue or item to go over is we're still working our way through the podcast prep. I'm sure people are like, why can't they just get these podcasts up? But we want to do it right. And so we will have these talks out as podcasts here soon. Hopefully next week will be the first one on the audio format. We'll have all our ducks in a row by then. These will include the bi-weekly politics talks that we're doing now, the bi-weekly econ talks, which are offset weeks from the politics talks, and then also some other topical things that we'll have. We'll talk tech, we'll talk all things China policy. We'll be playing around with the format. We're going to have a lot of fun. So, be on the lookout for that. I think it's going to be, a really powerful and informative podcast series. So we're excited to get that out. As I've mentioned before, these will not replace the flash talks. So for those of you who prefer the video, we'll still have those, so be on the lookout. And otherwise, into this week's topics, lots going on as always. So feel like we don't even need that precursor, but it's true yet again, even as we have the Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year bearing down on us, really kind of getting started late next week is the first official public holiday for that, starting Friday. But despite the myriad things that we could talk about, we're going to focus in on three things. First of all, is the growing rumors around the potential new appointment of a foreign minister or potential appointment of a new foreign minister. We'll talk about all the latest around that, discuss how it may or may not impact China's foreign policy, particularly at this tense moment in geopolitics. Feels like we're always at a tense moment in geopolitics, but I think you could argue that with the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, effectively the upcoming U.S. elections and elections across the world this year, quite an important moment for Chinese foreign policy. So whoever's at the helm of that will play an important role. Secondly, we'll look at the recent document issued on Friday by the State Council updating rules around domestic mergers and acquisitions and what they portend. We'll get into specifically why we're talking about this during that segment, but just want to remind everybody that this podcast is real, and Flash Talk, soon to be podcast, is really trying to focus in on the policy dynamics that are happening in Beijing. And a lot of times those things are not things that hit the headlines for foreigners. So we really want to talk about the conversation in China. And this is a top of mind development with, the most important governing body issuing these new regulations that we'll get into. And thirdly, we'll dive into preparations for the upcoming government meetings in March, the annual so-called two sessions. We'll read any tea leaves that we can for that important annual policy gathering. So without further ado, jump into the potential appointment of a new a minister of foreign affairs. So growing speculation that an official named Liu Jianchao will be appointed as China's new Minister of Foreign Affairs. We'll get into the speculation and latest developments in just a sec, but first a little background for those who may not remember kind of why we're here and why we may be needing or why China may be imminently appointing a new Minister of Foreign Affairs. The reason is because there has, shall we say, been some volatility at this position in the past few months. The most recent foreign minister, Qin Gang, was removed over the summer from his post amid a scandal and rumors that he had had an American-born child with a Chinese TV news anchor. So he was sort of gone, he went quiet there for a while, was out of the public eye, and then was suddenly dismissed from his role and as foreign minister and his position in the party. So we're not going to get into the specifics of that scandal. That's all been well covered by our politics team and others. But the upshot was, with Qin removed, he was replaced by Wang Yi, who's the current foreign minister and the predecessor to Qin Gang. So Wang Yi had kind of taken a step up in the party and was the sort of highest ranking party diplomat, but now is also serving once again as foreign minister, but sort of in a caretaker role as a new foreign minister is identified. And now with the upcoming two sessions in March, where there's typically a lot of personnel moves and appointment, there's speculation really heating up that someone new, namely Liu Jianchao, will be appointed to take the position. In fact, so last week we got reporting from the Wall Street Journal that around Liu taking this position potentially, according to quote people familiar with the matter, quoting the Wall Street Journal, Liu came in highly recommended to Xi Jinping by foreign affairs officials for his party experience and demonstrated political loyalty, traits especially valued by Xi Jinping at a time of heightened party control and emphasis on security. Now, as the journal says, Liu's appointment would be somewhat unusual, particularly because he has less traditional diplomatic experience, particularly vis-a-vis the United States, and more experience in sort of the party building and anti-corruption parts of the party. So, Trey, bring you in here. Given all of this background, what do you make of the reporting around Liu's potential appointment? And if it's true, do you see any implications for China's foreign policy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think first off, a little bit of, media reading 101. The journal quotes people familiar with the matter. That usually means it's not somebody who's actually an official or kind of has firsthand access of this. That said, the reporting rings true to us. I mean, I think actually ever since Qin was deposed in the summer, Liu has been the obvious candidate. And that's because, frankly, there just aren't that many kind of high-ranking diplomats within the party. So, on the Central Committee, there were 5 diplomats who are on the current Central Committee. One is Qin Gang. Obviously, he's out. Another is Wang Yi, who, is in that role right now as kind of an acting foreign minister. And then you had 3 others. You have Chi Yu, who's the party secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's not really even a diplomat, so he is somebody from within the internal party apparatus. It would be really weird if he was appointed foreign minister. You have a guy named Liu Haixing who works at the National Security Commission, kind of running the day-to-day affairs over there. And then you have Liu Jianchao, who is, head of the party's international liaison department. And of those, of all of those, he's the one that it makes the most sense for him to take over. Besides the fact that just, kind of on paper, he's the guy that you would think would take over the job. He's also clearly been groomed for the job in recent months. So he did a really high-profile trip to Australia in November. And then, I'm sure probably most people watching this or listening to this will know Liu from his recent trip to the United States just a few weeks ago. During that trip, he actually met with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. I mean, that is something that never happens. The head of the International Liaison Department, does not usually get a meeting with the Secretary of State. The reason that happened is because the U.S. has gotten signals from China that this guy is going to be the foreign minister. And so the fact that now the journal is saying he's going to be appointed doesn't really come as a surprise. I think, couple things about this. One, if he is appointed, he will be the number 2 diplomat in the system. That means he'll likely be the number 1 diplomat in a few years. So this guy will be really important. The other is, I would say, broadly speaking, that impressions of Liu are pretty positive in the kind of foreign diplomatic community.
Well, speaking of that, you mentioned his trip to the U.S. where he met with Blinken unusually, and as you stated, seemed to have made a good impression. The reporting around it was that is very positive. So what does his potential appointment as Minister of Foreign Affairs mean, if anything, for U.S.-China relations?
Well, I think, Liu's a good diplomat. And like I said, particularly on this recent trip to the US and the other trip to Australia, he made a really good impression in both countries. He's a fluent English speaker. He studied in the UK. Early in his career, he did a posting in the UK. Those that have spoken with him find him kind of, personable. He's also, when it comes to US China, he's never actually been posted to the US, but he did in about a decade ago. He worked a lot with the US, getting corrupt Chinese officials back to China. So he was working with the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and seems to have had good, working relations with them. So I think, broadly speaking, his appointment as foreign minister is kind of positive for US-China relations. I think it's positive for China's ability to conduct diplomacy around the world, because he seems like a really skilled diplomat. That said, Liu's allowed to be nice when he's allowed to be nice. And as soon as Xi Jinping says, you know what, we're in a moment now, kind of post San Francisco summit, where the signals from Beijing are, let's stabilize the US-China relationship, right? Let's improve things. And so Liu came here, and that was his message, and that was his vibe. If Xi Jinping decides that that's not where he wants to go, then Liu will fall into line, and he won't use his diplomatic charms. He'll probably be a much more combative presence, with the US and on the world stage. So, I think foreign policy in particular is one of those places where actually, Xi Jinping really cares a lot and oversees this, and there's not a lot of latitude for somebody like the foreign minister to really drive policy, which is actually different from some other areas, where more technical areas where actually personalities can really matter. But I would say something like US-China relations, Liu will, if he's lucky, maybe he'll have some input into the discussion, but he's not going to be making the policy.
Yeah, party officials cooperating with DHS and DOJ to repatriate corrupt Chinese officials to the mainland. That's a relic of a bygone era for sure. So we'll be keeping a lookout for Liu. Although I do one last thing, kind of want to go over. I saw this morning that Axios had a piece on this, on Liu and his potential, appointment, that I wanted to get your reaction to. Specifically, they outlined Liu's position in the CCP, the Communist Party, as, head of the International Liaison Department, as evidence that the party is taking over policymaking. And they did so with what I'd call the characteristic kind of conspiratorial air that has become de rigueur in reporting on China, particularly when it involves the party. So they said a shadowy and obscure bureau in the Chinese Communist Party is rapidly asserting dominance over China's foreign policy. Pretty typical, but quite pointed there. They say why it matters in the long run, it could reshape international relations to favor Beijing. The office that manages relations with political parties in other countries, known as the International Department, is taking center stage. Its current chief, Liu Jintao, is likely to become the country's next foreign minister. Diplomacy led by the party, as opposed to the foreign ministry, gives Beijing a powerful and largely unscrutinized back channel with political power brokers in other countries. Now, I'm not trying to pick on Axios here. I do feel like a lot of that very just charged language happens all the time in Western reporting on China, and we're not here by any means to, defend China or take their side. We're trying to present as we see it, kind of China's view on these things. But what's your reaction to this kind of characterization of a potential Liu appointment? I mean, obviously the party is taking on a greater role in policymaking and governance across a range of areas. I mean, everyone knows that, and that's been happening for years and will continue to. But is it true to characterize it as saying that the party taking a greater role here will create, quote, a largely unscrutinized back channel with political power brokers in other countries? What's your take there?
I feel like that's maybe a leading question. I also feel like you perhaps know what I'm going to say. I mean, yeah, it's frustrating. Although I don't know, maybe it's not frustrating. I mean, this is why we're here, right? And if actually people understood how China works, we'd probably have less business. So, it's in a certain sense, it's frustrating reading something like this, but also, I guess at least satisfying to be able to kind of give a little bit more context and nuance around the conversation. I mean, broadly speaking, yeah, the party runs everything in China, including foreign affairs, and they have done so forever, right? I mean, so that hasn't changed. The party has taken a more prominent role in kind of many areas of policymaking under Xi Jinping. And the International Liaison Department that Liu currently heads has become more active over the past decade. But there's just a few things that this kind of gets wrong. I mean, first, my guess is that Liu will not be the International Liaison Department head when he takes over as foreign minister, right? So somebody else will be doing that, and the head of the International Liaison Department will be doing what they've always been doing, which is liaising with other parties around the world. It's also not really that shadowy, right? I mean, like, I've met people from the International Liaison Department. They hold like big forums, they publicize their meetings. It's kind of another functional wing of China's diplomatic force. It tends, we don't see it a lot because it tends to it runs point on relations with other communist countries, of which there are only 4, right? North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. So, it's never actually really been, it's always been a high profile job, but it's not necessarily, the foreign minister is a much bigger job, right? And Liu's role is going to change once he becomes foreign minister. I'll also just, last thing here that I'll point out is that this is not uncommon. So Dai Bingguo, who was China's top diplomat, from 2008 to 2013, had great relations with the United States, great relations in particular with Hillary Clinton, because he ran point on the strategic and economic dialogue. So he was Clinton's, opposite when she was Secretary of State. He ran the International Liaison Department earlier in his career, right? It's all, it's not uncommon for a diplomat in China to maybe spend some time in the International Liaison Department. And so Liu's appointment isn't, I don't know, it's not really out of the ordinary, and it doesn't really indicate that anything important has changed in the way that China conducts its diplomacy.
Yeah, you're right. That was a leading question. You answered it very well, though, and I'll just throw in my 2 cents quickly, which is, just the way this is characterized as a largely unscrutinized back channel. In my view, that's just because people aren't scrutinizing it. Complaining that it's unscrutinized because no one's paying attention is not a legitimate complaint. But also, I mean, your point about Dai Bingguo is also great because it also points out there's a lot of analysis, I think, increasingly in the US towards China, where it's like, oh, this is the first time I've seen this happen. And so now I'm calling it out as new and unusual. But actually, if you go and look back, these are things that have been happening for a while and we didn't consider them unusual before. And it's just kind of how the system works. So I kind of, always point that out to new analysts on China. Not that the Axios people are new analysts, but just because we're noticing something for the first time doesn't mean it's happening for the first time. So
Well,
interesting.
sorry, I got to jump in
Yeah.
real quick because on the inscrutable secretive body part, I just decided to Google in Chinese the International Liaison Department. I'm now on their website where all of the activities of Liu Jianqiao, I mean, the public activities are listed,
Yeah.
right? So it's just
Yeah.
like, oh, Liu Jianqiao goes and sees Secretary General of the UN, Liu Jianqiao, here's the whole American visit, right? That's what that is. But here's him also, um, in Beijing, he goes to meet the Polish ambassador. He goes to meet an Iranian official. He goes to meet unsurprisingly, the Laotian ambassador. He goes to meet a legislative delegation from France. So also, I mean, I said they run point on relations with other communist countries, but it's not like they're unknown to Western countries as well, or that nobody's ever interacted with them. So, again, I feel like, yeah, it's very, very misleading kind of characterization.
Yeah, those do not sound like unscrutinized back channels to
Yeah.
me. And another great point you made was just, I mean, the reporting around Leo's trip to the US like was highly scrutinized, so and well publicized. So again, just something to keep in mind there as we kind of think through how China works, and it's important to not kind of have this sort of reactionary, in my view, reactionary approach to all things party. The party is present in China, and we just have to get used to how it works. So, anyway, moving from all of that to more sort of hardcore or specific domestic policy, I wanted to talk a little bit about some regulations passed by the State Council last week. I previewed this at the top. On Friday, the State Council published revised regulations for mergers and acquisitions. These updates have been in the works since June 2020 and have been the subject of pretty heated debate, which we'll get into specifically as it involves big tech companies in China. Again, just want to quickly say here that not everything in China is all about foreign affairs and about the US. And just, I know I said it at the top, but our goal here is to talk about what are the top policy issues that are being spoken about in Beijing. And when the State Council issues a big document like this, we pay attention, and we think it matters for, businesses operating there, for, other foreign actors, for investors, for foreign governments, to understand the domestic policy agenda, which then shapes, foreign policy as well. So, this may seem out of the realm of interest for most people, but we really think if you want to understand what's happening in China, this is the kind of thing you have to pay attention to. So, on these State Council regulations, these were sort of the final version of the regulations that had been deliberated for 10 months. And they were notable because they dropped a clause from an earlier version that would have required government approval for any acquisition of a firm with revenue over renminbi 100 billion, which is $14 billion. So the reason there was pushback there was it's a relatively low bar for companies to acquire other companies, and it can kind of gum up the works if the government's kind of constantly get involved in these kind of mergers and acquisitions when they could just go forward under sort of normal market rules. So first of all, kind of Trey, I've done a little bit of previewing, but in your view, why is the State Council focused on M&A in the first place? Like I said, if you read the sort of Western press, officials should be focused on putting out economic fires and the economy's, going down the toilet. So if that's the case, why kind of be focused on a more ho-hum aspect of merger review at this moment?
Well, I mean, I think that question is pretty simple. I mean, I think the framing is just totally wrong, right? I mean, they're It's because they're managing the second largest economy in the world, and they're constantly, trying to figure out how to do that. And antitrust rules are really important to managing a modern economy. I mean, I think this actually gets to one of the things that I think is most fascinating about China is that they came to this to managing a market economy late, right? So, I mean, if you come out of the Cultural Revolution, 1970s, early 1980s, you had no courts. You didn't even have law. You didn't even have anybody that understood. You had no lawyers. You had no banks. You had basically no financial system. And so China's, I still, 45 years later, is playing catch up with Europe, with the United States, where these systems of a market economy have been being built over centuries, not decades. So I mean, again, you look at antitrust, America Sherman Antitrust Act. I don't know when that is. Progressive area, probably like 1910, 1911 or something, right? China didn't pass its anti-monopoly law until 2007 or 2008, so 100 years later. And we know this because we are in the weeds every day. China's putting out a lot of regulations because in a lot of places they don't have any regulations. They don't have a framework for governing economic activity. So I think, when you ask, oh, why are they focused on M&A regulations? It's because more broadly, they're still kind of in the middle of this process of building out kind of a regulatory framework for a market economy. And so anyway, I mean, when it comes to M&A in particular, it's been a really hot topic in China. I mean, they've been doing a lot. They created a new anti-monopoly authority in 2018. They've, hired a bunch of people. It's been a hot topic, not least because it's a hot topic globally. I mean, there's a lot of antitrust talk in the US as well. So, I think you need to see these new rules in that context. Like they're not, these have been in the works for 20 months, as we said, and they're actually part of a much longer effort that's been going on for close to a decade to build out the antitrust regulatory framework. So I guess that's the probably too long answer to your to
No,
your
that's
toss away question.
that's great. I mean, it's a point I go back to pretty regularly. I just Googled the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was first passed in 1890. So we
Yeah.
had even a bigger jump on China than you indicated, but the point stands. And something I point out is like the central bank, for example, while established, originally in kind of the early 1900s, and then the modern version in the 1940s, the real in its current formation, the central bank was effectively established in the 1990s. So they've been doing modern central banking for 30 years. That's it. So I think that's a great point, and there it does underscore why they're always going to be focused on these things broadly, but maybe more importantly, getting down to the brass tacks of what the domestic companies are focused on. Why do you think this RMB 100 billion review provision was dropped, and what does it tell us about economic policy these days, and specifically what might implications be for the tech industry?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, first of all, just to understand this provision a little bit and why it was so controversial is that, traditionally what you've had is if both parties, both the acquirer and the one being acquired are of a certain size, and actually it's a pretty small threshold. I think it's 400 million in annual revenue, which is pretty small, but they each had to meet that threshold before you would consider, whether or not it had to go through government review. And this just says that if it doesn't matter how tiny the company being acquired is, so it could just be, I don't know, your Xiaomaibu on the corner or something. I mean, it could be, literally kind of $100,000 acquisition, but if Baidu, who makes over 100 billion a year, wanted to buy that little shop, then they would have to get approval from the regulator to do that because they have over 100 billion. So I mean, Baidu is a good example because it's the big tech companies that were kind of the origin of this provision in the first place. So, I mean, let's think about this. This was June 2022 when this provision was originally put in. That was kind of the tail end, but still very much, during the tech crackdown, and was a product of that. And so I think what's so interesting about these new regulations is that, first of all, it took 20 months after they put out the draft update for it to get done. And the reason that happens is because there was a lot of arguing, both within the bureaucracy, but also from the corporate sector, private companies, and also state-owned companies. There are only actually, I think, around 200 companies that would hit that threshold, that 100 billion threshold, and about half of them are state-owned companies, right? Which are some of the biggest companies in China. So they also were not a fan of this. And so again, I just think it's interesting. Everybody always thinks that, Xi Jinping is kind of sitting in his office deciding everything. Or if he's not, then, the antitrust regulator is sitting there and they decide and they tell everybody what to do and everybody goes and does it. And actually what you can see from, the process by which these regulations were passed is that it's not that simple and that there is a lot of input. I mean, in this case, maybe for better or for worse, right? Like, I mean, this is essentially big tech getting its way, big companies getting its way. I mean, you could argue that this is not, that provision maybe should have been there. But I think, what's interesting to me about it is that it does show that business has a lot of input into the policymaking process and can get its way in the policymaking process. And so I think more broadly, why, besides that kind of basic fact, I do think that, what these new regulations show us is number one, the tech crackdown is over. I mean, I think we knew that already, but everybody's so scarred that I think every new sign that it's over is still kind of comes as a bit of comfort to these big tech companies, and the investors invested in them. And I think more broadly, it probably is a sign of the fact that in general, I think the government is trying to be more pro-business right now, right? And that in the end, they ended up coming down on what was seen as kind of the pro-business side of the ledger, and that reflects kind of a broader trend that we see in policymaking and regulation right now.
Certainly seeing a very different tune in terms of how regulators are characterizing Chinese tech companies these days, how Chinese regulators are characterizing, very much throwing their arms around them. It seems as though they sort of undertook this crackdown and then thought to themselves, oh, wait a second, we actually need these companies to employ people. And so are doing a bit of backtracking now that the economy is in a much more challenging place. But that is one of those things that ebbs and flows certainly over time and will continue to. So the last thing to discuss here for the week is the upcoming preparations or the preparations for the upcoming two sessions. So for just quick background, most people will know this, but the two sessions happens every year. It's the annual meeting of the government, technically the legislature and the top political advisory, but also the state council is involved. And in these meetings, basically key officials lay out economic goals and priorities for the year, including the GDP growth target, the budget deficit, and a host of other metrics. A lot of these broad policy priorities and even some of the specific targets were already agreed or decided back in December at the party's annual Central Economic Work Conference, aka the unscrutinized economic back channel that the party has with itself when it's deciding economic policy. I'm going to get in trouble for this, I'm sure. But at the March meetings, the government meetings, are when these priorities and targets are officially released publicly for the first time each year, and where we get more details in many cases. The most kind of scrutinized part of this, or watched or listened to part of it, is the Premier's government work report. So will be Li Chang's first government work report to deliver, and he'll kind of outline a bunch of goals for the upcoming year. That said, even though a lot of the things have been decided, and there's not a ton of scope to deviate from that. There's a lot of preparation that goes into these meetings, especially, right now, time's tight because we're about to enter a 2-3 week basically holiday period during the Lunar New Year, which officially kind of the holiday starts next Friday in terms of people taking off work in China. So things are ramping up now. And over the past week, we've seen two important meetings that appear to be shaping some of the priorities and outcomes that we'll see at the two sessions. The first was on January 23rd. Li Chang, the Premier, solicited feedback on the government work report that he will deliver at the two sessions from businessmen, economists, and other experts, excuse me. And then he followed up that meeting a few days later by soliciting feedback from China's 8 democratic parties, as well as the head of the All China Federation for Industry and Commerce, and an economist named Li Daohui, David Lee, who's kind of a well-known commentator and policy advisor. So, Trey, talk us through these meetings. What are they? Should we read much into them? Will they tell us anything about where economic policy is headed this year?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, I would just say, it's not totally clear how the sausage is made. And it's also not totally clear that some of those targets that are decided at the Central Economic Work Conference don't get tweaked in the kind of 3 months leading up to the government work report. So, I mean, obviously, in 2020, extreme cases, but that was a time where they decided. I mean, actually, they ended up delaying it until May, didn't they? But what was decided in December 2019 was not what ended up being revealed in May 2020. And I think, although I can't think of specific examples at the moment, I feel like there have been other instances where actually some of these meetings here have led to revisions, maybe not of the growth target or something that's that prominent, but of some of the policy priorities in the government work report. So I do think that we shouldn't underestimate the fact that actually, these meetings are important, and they're continuing to, while the big decisions were made in December, I think they were, if not in pencil, then maybe in kind of erasable pen. And I think they're still, they're not afraid to change them as we run up to the government work report. So that said, unfortunately, we know absolutely nothing about what's going to be in the government work report, judging from these meetings. So the readouts were incredibly terse and really gave no indication of kind of what was discussed, except for in the broadest terms. That said, they were actually, I think, probably interesting more from a procedural perspective. So, as you said, this is Li Chang's first government work report. This is his first, he's coming up on his 1-year anniversary as premier. And, I think one of the biggest questions that we've had over the past year is what kind of government would Li Chang run? How would he be, empowered or not empowered as premier? Basically, how would China function getting its first new premier in 10 years? And what was interesting about these meetings is that, as opposed to years past, they were much smaller. So with the exception of Executive Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang and State Councilor Wu Zhenglong, who is not missing, There were no other vice premiers or state councilors there, which is rare. And also, usually these meetings, the state council will have a plenary session. So everybody in the state council will get together to go over the draft government work report. That usually happens before these kind of feedback sessions are held. But as far as we know, this year that plenary session has not been held. So it looks like this feedback session was held before that. And so, two takeaways from these procedural changes. First is that, by allowing these people to put in their feedback before you have the plenary session, that would imply that there's a better chance that this feedback will be incorporated in, because it's coming in a little bit earlier in the process. And that, I would say, broadly is in line with what Li Qiang has said he was going to do. I mean, he made a big deal when he took over in March of saying everybody needs to go out and solicit opinions, and that officials needed to do more to understand, what the average Joe wanted and the problems they were facing. And then the second one is that this much smaller meeting also implies a much more kind of streamlined and centralized process for putting together the government work report. And this is something else that we've seen under Li Qiang. He revived something called the Premier's work meetings, which is something. Now these truly are opaque; they're not publicized, but it was publicized that he revived them. It's not publicized when they meet or what happens. But they're basically smaller meetings. They were employed to great effect by Zhu Rongji in the late 90s and early 2000s as kind of a quicker forum through which the state council could make policy. And so, again, it just looks like, although we don't know exactly what the stamp is going to be, I think it's safe for us to say that this is Li Qiang's government work report. And that's part of the reason I think that this is a particularly kind of anticipated 2 sessions.
Well, we'll get more details obviously soon, about 6 weeks out. Like I said, it's going to be quiet in China on the policymaking front here, starting basically next week. Just wanted to quickly sort of tag on for watchers and listeners the Wu Zhenglong comment that Trey made 2 weeks ago. We discussed how Wu had been kind of out of the public eye. He is basically the chief of staff for Li Qiang. He's a state councilor and had not been seen. And so, rumors were flying around that maybe another state councilor is going down. But right after we did that flash talk, he was back. So, likely sick or some personal issue, which, reminds us of the opacity of the Chinese system. But it also reminds us that often Occam's razor can just be that, people get sick and sometimes they're out of the public view for a while. But so just good to touch on that since we, talked about it last time. And I will point out that Trey's first comment was, let's just reserve judgment here and see what happens. And we'll see what happens with the government work report as well and see if there's anything interesting that comes out of that based on that feedback. But otherwise, for now, I think we'll leave it there. Trey, thanks for all the comments and analysis. Great stuff. Pleasure as always, and look forward to continuing to do these with you going forward. Appreciate the time, and we'll see you soon.
Sounds good.
Bye, everybody.